Thank you, Edie. And I think a lot of people do know my story, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. But first of all, I want to kind of introduce this story and tell you about this sculpture that I made and took from Stowe, Vermont to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and stopped 5 times in between those venues to set it up and expose it to the public in different places along the way. So I'll tell you that story, and I'll tell you the facts, what I know, what I did, what I think. At the end of the story, you just have to draw your own conclusions about whether it was nuts or not. But the story is really more about people and ideas, which are the core of this whole thing. So I hope that it's more than just the nuts and bolts of this metal sculpture. That would be kind of cold. It's a long story. I'm going to breeze through it as fast as I can. I'll talk fast. We need a couple of volunteers in the back. If you can't hear me, then just shout out louder. You're self-appointed and everyone's invited. By way of introduction further about this, I grew up in Stowe Village, just 200 yards from here. I attended Stowe High School and in fact sat in geometry class right about there. I had typing in that room, so I have a long anchoring history to this building, including being a trustee of the institution here for 9 years. And during that time, I sat on the building committee that oversaw the renovations that were going on when the Art Center was young. My wife and I had an art gallery for 18 years on the Mountain Road, and we sold that 5 years ago, and then it was, of all people, Terry, good job. Here, let me introduce her. But I think the most relevant part of my connection to the Art Center here, because it's connected to the whole tour, is that in 1994, fellow sculptor, colleague, and longtime friend John Matus, who's here this evening, he and I were tapped to curate a little sculpture show that was called Vermont Sculpture Out of Doors, and it took place on the lawn here. And we looked at each other and said, well, why is that? Let's get it out there. So this was the first time that sculpture went into the village, and it was a battle. We had to fight to get it out there. But this is the exhibit catalog from that 1994 exhibit. The reason that I'm dwelling on that is because the underpinnings, of the philosophical underpinnings, the reason that we wanted to move that art out there was because we wanted to bring it into the community. We wanted to expose people who weren't going to come to the Art Center, would not come into the wall inside and see what's here. Maybe they were not interested in art, maybe they were a little intimidated by art, maybe they didn't know what art was about. So we figured, let's just push it out to where it's in their face. That idea is really the same as this tour that I took to push this sculpture out in front of people, not in an obnoxious way, but to allow them to be exposed. In a lot of the venues, people were not art people for sure. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But the 5 stops, most of them were not art venues. And so the people that I met along the way, this was sometimes a brand new exposure to them. So I was happy to be able to do that, and that's the way that went. I felt, and we both felt, and it still is the same way, that people who are deprived of art, it's kind of like, what if they're deprived of music? And if you're deprived of something, don't know about it, you don't know what you're missing. So this was an effort to bring some art to people generally, but also to people who really were unfamiliar with the art kind of writ large. But before I talk about the sculpture, I want to pause and talk about inspiration, or I guess creativity in general. Because that's a hard topic to talk about. You can't put your finger on it. It's kind of like my mentor in college, Paul Aschenbach, who talked a lot of philosophical ideas about art, really didn't teach us too much technique, but he really had an impact on my life. And he talked about that really difficult topic as like a donut hole. It's really hard to talk about the donut hole because you must describe it by talking about the donut. And so there's going to be a little bit of that here. You can't really put your finger on a lot of these specific concepts. But the practice of creativity, and I call it the practice rather than the ability, because it is a skill that is developed and goes on. And I think that one of the important things about it is that it's the combining of different separate, unrelated ideas that lead to synthesize like, oh, that might work out. So I want to show you this little sculpture, and I don't by any means want to say that it's particularly pretty, but I'll tell you the story about this. We had a glass sculptor that worked in our building, and he had a bunch of scrap one day and said, hey, what do I do with this stuff? And I looked at this bucket full of these things. I said, Paul, you can't throw that out. And he goes, well, I'm going to. I said, well, throw it my way. So I got the bucket of glass and stuck it under my, permanent storage, basically. 10 years later, maybe 3 years ago-ish, I dug through it, found these 2 shards of glass, and started fiddling them, putting them together. And when they went together in that shape, I thought, oh man, that is something. Not that this was going to be great, but for a long time I'd been interested in this kind of shape. That I made in 2002, and this predated that by a couple of years, and it has a remarkable resemblance to that vertical in the sculpture that you'll see more of later. But those 2 different ideas, I think, were a good example of the whole creative process. After that kind of aha moment, that revelation, that like, oh, ooh, that could really work, I was so convinced that it would that I immediately started drawing in CAD. So I want to talk about that a little bit because some people in my sphere have actually said to me, oh, CAD, easy, you just download it from the internet and then you have it. And I'm here to tell you that isn't the way it works. CAD's pretty deep, there's many flavors of it. I've been at it 15 years, I still consider myself a novice. I use 4 different CAD programs. The one that I used this for is called TouchCAD. And the reason it's called that is because it's very tactile. You can almost touch these curves and bump them a little bit into a different curve. It's very tactile. It's a Swedish program, and I'm not great at it, but I can do it. It's great for curved surfaces like boat hulls, airplane wings, sailboat sails, inflatable structures, that sort of thing. It's a really powerful technology, obviously, but it's great for me because although creating the original drawings, the first drawings, is frustrating and time-consuming and like a lot of this, but once you have that, you can make very quick changes or modifications, explorations. I think I did about 100 different variations of this before we decided on this particular thing. And I was communicating with the woman who finally commissioned this along the way, making modifications that she could look at and understand. The other thing that it enables you to do is get a full look at the thing without ever being able to reach into the screen. So you can turn it, you can look at it different upside down in different ways. So that's a nice thing. It also allows me to make 3D prints. So here's a early print, a crude print of this concept. And it allows you to communicate with industrial facilities. If you walk into a manufacturing facility and say, hey, I'm an artist, can you do this? And you show them a little drawing, they're going to say, no, we don't do that. But if you go with a CAD file, they say, well, let's take a look. So that language enables you to have access to facilities that are anywhere in the world, really. one of the things that is useful for me is that it allows you to unfold the model, and I'll use these little things here. This was the working model that we abused for a lot during the construction of it. It's made the same way with little thin pieces of aluminum, and I'll talk more about how they fit together just sort of automatically. But these forms are then unfolded to flat sheet cutting patterns, and the smart machine says, okay, now I know what you want, and it cuts out beautiful patterns or beautiful parts. It also allows you to find out where the join points are. A big project like this, you would, to start welding it, you would not start at the end because any errors that occur get multiplied as you move down the structure. So you would normally start welding this together in the middle and work both ways. But you need to know where that is because the parts might fit together really well like this, but if they're off like this, you'll have big problems. The thing just won't go together. So these join points are numbered, and the number 5 over here is going to match with the number 5 over there, and you know where to begin. The other good thing about this particular design, which has triangular cross-section, is that there can't be any racking in it. Those 3 sides are just plain going to go together. If you have a 4-sided thing, it can rack, it can squash, and so that you can manage that, but in a triangular cross-section, you don't have to manage it. It also gives you fold lines, and what this is for particularly curved surf pieces like this one, which is so curved, this would go through a roller to start the curve on it, and these lines there show you how that should go through the roller so that the amount of twist is correct, the amount of bend is correct. So all of those things come out of this program. The other thing that's really great is you can insert it into digital renderings. So when I was working with the landscape architect on this project, this was a digital rendering that was just cooked up out of thin air, all the trees and everything else, and then I sent him the file. And we had a little lost in translation because this was about 40 feet high. And so after I saw that, I had to call him, and I didn't really know what to say. I said, hey, Jack, do you think that's a little outsized or what? And he said, yeah, it looks a little big. We'll bring it down. How about 24 feet? And I said, sure, that'll be great. So that's the way that happened. Anyway, at that stage, I had developed the design. I loved the design. I really wanted to make it. I knew it was scalable. I could make a pretty small one and it probably would work. But I wanted to have it high enough that you could walk through it, that you didn't bang your head on it, that it was going to be large. And for that, I needed a patron. Large sculptures, most sculptors, and me included, just plain can't afford to take on a project like that on spec and just build it. So it needs to be done as a commission, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Luckily, just a few months after this design was frozen, I was contacted by a woman who had seen a show I had at the Tulsa Botanic Garden, obviously in Tulsa, in 2018. And she called me and said, I'm doing this project. Is there something we could talk about? And of course, I said, yeah, please, love to have that. So she had her landscape architect send me the drawings of the garden, which was quite extensive. And I put those blue arrows in there to show that there was a designated spot for art. So, it got a little bit bigger later. So I worked with the landscape architect quite a bit to, fit into his design. I wanted to be sure that not just the client was happy with the outcome, but that the style and the feeling of it was going to be appropriate for this very formal garden that you'll see pictures of later. He was very enthusiastic and helped push the whole concept forward. So let me talk about commissioning the sculpture just for a little bit. I've done enough to be wary about commissions that I don't think are going to go well, and to invite ones and participate them and embrace them if it looks like you know, you have a good chance of success. And I've developed this kind of belief that these are the keys to it. You got to have chemistry with the person that's commissioning it. If you don't like each other, it's going to be a disaster. So you got to have a little bit of chemistry, and you must have an aesthetic compatibility. You got to like the same stuff, or at least what you like must overlap. Duh, they wouldn't have contacted you if that wasn't sort of true. There needs to be agreement about the function of the artwork. And I think art does things. I don't think it's passive. So in the case of that garden that I just showed you, the function of this artwork was to look at from the distance, but it was a beckoning point to say, come into the garden, come check me out. And then when you got there, the archway, this thing, spanned a logical pedestrian pathway further into the garden. So it became a gateway. So it functioned both as a beckoning point from afar and as a gateway to go further into the garden. Obviously, budget, got to agree on how much it's going to cost, and decisions, how much does the patron want to be involved in all the little minutia of what must go on, finding a way through the design to get it done. Do they just want the big picture? I don't care, just show me the end. Or, hey, I got this new idea that might be good, do you want to see it? So you must work out how much time, energy, and effort the collector wants to put into that, and that's just a matter of choice. I'm good with it either way. But there must be a commitment to pay attention to this, respond when there's questions, and keep the whole project moving forward. Really frustrating for any artist to have a disengaged, disinterested patron. And of course, if you gotta have trust, because this is a leap of faith. You can show all the designs you want, cross your fingers, but at the end of the day, when they write the check, they're putting their faith and trust in your ability to deliver. In this case, I had never met the woman in person. We met by Skype, we did emails, we talked by phone, but the interaction with her was really not that time consuming for her. I knew she didn't, but she did say, partway into this, she said, you know, I just can't pay attention to this now. I'm just feeling overwhelmed. I just have to table it. And I said, absolutely, you know, this is supposed to be pleasurable. You shouldn't, if it's a burden, then let's just back off, which we did. And 3 months went by. And because she said, you know, let's take it up in April. April came, and so I called her and said, how you feeling? Do you want to proceed or what? She goes, yes, we've got a lot of things that have been resolved. She had just done this giant renovation in her house, and she was doing that big garden. So that moved forward, and I thought, okay, good, I have to make a proposal, and what I needed to know was several things. First of all, is this possible to build? It was too big for me to do in my studio. I can't handle something that big. I don't have equipment big enough to roll the thickness of material. So this was going to have to be outsourced to other fabricators. Who would do it? Who could I recruit to do it and let me also oversee it enough to make sure that the quality was going to be there, that it was going to be in the budget and on time. And I had to trust them to do this also. So we had to develop a rapport. And it started through CAD drawings. First of all, do you understand this CAD drawing that I just emailed you? Yeah, we got it. Please send a picture of it back to me so I know that we're on the same page. Well, we were, but you know how digital things go. Finally, all the costs, sourcing the material, which, by the way, during that time, nickel, which is a prime component of stainless steel, was going all over the place. So the fabricator gave me a price, but they said, hey, you know, that's good for 10 days. I said, okay, well, this decision is probably going to take longer than that. So we finally had to come to a way of knowing, all right, this is the price plus the fluctuation of the materials, as a commodity. So that was fine. Needed to know about that, needed to know that they could fabricate it, that they had the skills and interest and attention of paying to the level of quality that I was after, because, they were in the industrial arts and I'm in the fine arts, and that took a little dialogue to bring them along. So they had to be able to do the fabrication, the finishing. I had to worry about transportation, about the installation, and the big unknown and the big expense. Does it need an engineering stamp? Does an engineer have to certify that it's safe? And I didn't know about what that would be required out in Tulsa, whether that was like hurricane stuff, that tornado standard that I didn't know about. So I kind of asked that question, do we really need this? And of course the architect says, well, yeah, we better get that. Little did he know, right? So I said, oh no. The first proposal that I got had an allowance for engineering for $35,000, which was just shockingly high to me, but it turned out that it was great that that fabricator and I had this dialogue, because they were intending to do this construction called frame and skin. They were going to build a frame for this thing and then skin it with a thin sheath of metal. And I knew from my experience that this is not going to work. You can do it, but it won't look good. There'll be weld joints all over the place. There'll be facets. I was pretty much insisting on what's called monocoque construction, and that's a French word for single shell, and it means there's no internal bracing. Why that's important in this case is because the material, the flat sheets of this that assume these natural curves define the shape, and for this sculpture, smoothness and the lack of little kinks and jumps was really, really important. So those curves are called cubic splines, and you've seen it all the time in a flexible piece of wood like this. It turns out that the wood is trying to go to its lowest energy state given the amount of force that's bending it. And that's exactly what happens with the metal in the sculpture. So this monocoque construction eliminates excess welds, provides really smooth curves, and the places where they meet define the curves. So it sort of automatically comes together. If you get the flat sheets correct and you join them in the right place, it just folds together very beautifully. Remember, these are all mathematical curves, so they're supposed to fit. So eventually, the client decided that we didn't need an engineering stamp. So that was terrific. And that also meant that the next place I was going to go, because the first guy just would not hear about this. He did not want to do it. He was strictly going to do that internal bracing, and that was a non-starter for me. So I recruited this shop in Barrie, right across from my Barrie studio. That is a machine shop and fabrication shop, and they've been in business forever, and they got a million different giant machines and very skilled workers, but they're in the industrial arts. So this was a dialogue again. Do you want to do this project? Can you do it to this standard? Let me see samples. It's going to be an adventure. Are you up for it? Or you just want to not do it? And finally they came along, and we decided we would do it together, and I would have them do it in their shop because it was too big for me. So I was ready to write the proposal to the client, and I wrote it, and I included a 3D print with these little figures there to show scale about it. And I was going to send it out to her, and I started writing the narrative, and I realized, oh, this is way too technical. She doesn't care about what the alloy is, what the welding rods are, or even the joint design. She wants to know about the content. What's it mean? What is it? What's it? Why should I love it? She wants the emotion part of it. And that's when I thought, oh yeah, this untitled sculpture really needs a name, and then we can talk about what it means and what the intent is. So I want to talk about titles for a minute. And Robert Motherwell famously wrote, "The function of the artist is to express reality as felt." And so that kind of means that there's a subjective part of that the artist expresses through his work, her work, and through the titles. And also a vision through the eyes of the artist about what they perceive as the objective reality that's out there. So I think there's those two things. But I felt during this period of 2016 to 2020, it was a dark time for me personally. And it was reflected in some of the things that I titled things. Here's some examples. Thought cage. Eclipse of reason. A deep divide. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? Blabbermouth. And by the way, Blabbermouth was banned from Instagram because the narrative that I wrote was deemed to be too political. And then maybe the darkest one, The End of Truth. These are dark titles. You're not happy. With this particular sculpture that really is aspirational and that it's soaring, I wanted to have a title that reflected that. These are, it's a much different flavor than The End of Truth. I have an interest in the heavens. I can't say astronomy because that's more of a science. But I do like the idea of peering up at the night sky and contemplating it all. So this idea here of an aspirational title, that place in the stars, seemed to make sense for me. It was appropriate for the client because she had just undertaken this giant project, and I said to her, you seem to aim high. So she liked that title, and we went with it, and now it was time to move on for that. So she accepted the proposal, and we moved into fabrication. So on the left, you see the flat sheets that were defined by my CAD program. They had to do it in 3 sections because for them too, the 24-foot length was excessive, so they built it in 3 different chunks, and those are some of the pieces that are there. And you see them being drawn together with clamps. That is a great example of how monocoque construction takes place. There's no internal bracing, just as they move up there and spot weld it together to hold it together, it just folds together almost automatically. It's really a beautiful thing. And all along, when you're working with stainless steel and you want a fine finish on it, you have to take care of it the whole way. Scratches are terrible to get out. I used to tell studio assistants, look, every minute that you spend preventing damage to this stainless steel saves at least 10 minutes of fixing. So we always would pad things, we take very careful care. These guys weren't doing that. But that's okay because the finish was their responsibility also. So I couldn't really tell them, hey, don't put those clamps on there, dude, that's not good. So they moved forward with it. And we'd go and consult with them, check it out, see how it was coming, make sure that it was doing the right thing. And then we hit a major wall, and the project stopped. And it stopped because they could not do the finish work. They could not do the finish work, even though they had supplied samples to me, small, because the piece was so large it could not fit into any booth. I had specified and wanted a glass bead finish. And what that is tiny spheres of glass that are sandblasted onto the surface, and they peen it. And so you don't have that busy ground stainless steel surface. And I had pushed for that finish. I had told the client that it would be sort of creamy rather than metallic. It would be like going to that place in the stars by moonbeam instead of rocket. Well, there was no backing off after that. But the fabricator couldn't do it. And they said, this is the best we can do. And I thought, oh, no. Aside from the, not filling the contract out, the clock's ticking. I got to get this thing done. And I knew it was possible, but I didn't know who could do it or where, and it's winter time. So let me say a word about perseverance. I don't consider myself a patient person. I'm not patient, but I have had to become more patient and persevere by my work in stone. Stonework is inherently very slow. Stone resists subjugation fiercely and for a long time. And so if you're going to overcome it, you need a sustained effort, and that is perseverance. There's a lot of language in the stone world which kind of exemplifies this. You've heard about chipping away at something. The grind, there's a lot of grinding in stonework. There's another word I'm trying to think of now. Well, let's see if I got the notes here. I don't know what happened to it. The grind, grit. The abrasive used to polish is called grit. So this perseverance combined with unbending resolve, like I had to figure this out, it's a very powerful tool. And I used it, and I was on the phone and on the internet for about a whole week searching for a facility that could do this. I looked in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in Maine, in eastern New York, and finally in southern Massachusetts. Oh yeah, we can do that for you. I said, you can do 24 feet? Yeah. I said, okay. They gave me a price on it, and I said, okay, but he said, well, you got to bring it down. I said, well, I will. He said, yeah, but when it's done, you got to bring it back. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, this surface, you can't, after it's done, you can't touch it. You can't like bolt it onto your truck. Well, you can bolt it on, but you can't strap it on, lay it down and strap it on. So we had to build this rack. And when the rack was completed, I thought, I'm going to see how that thing goes. And if it goes to Massachusetts, well, maybe I might consider driving it out there myself. We were talking about two different ideas. So we have this big problem of finishing the sculpture somehow, and a little problem of getting it out there. And those two things came together and got me thinking about, what, if I bring it out there myself, there's a lot less logistics. Otherwise, I got a flatbed that meets a crane at precisely the right time. I got to be there myself, got to fly out, get a car, all that stuff. So anyway, that's how the idea came about to drive it out there. Another big problem was handling this thing. It's tapered, it's smooth, it's slippery, and you can't touch it. So I thought, when I get it out there, what am I gonna do? The crane guys won't know how to handle it, and it's really finicky. And when you set this thing down, the 900-pound piece, down onto those bolts, it's gotta just go down really great. It can't go down like this or like that. It has to be down precisely so that it can be bolted down. So I realized I had to have a handling system, and I went back to this model, and I think there's only one little thread on here now, but I started studying how this balanced with this model and thread. And after a time, I was able to develop a handling system for this that allowed the vertical piece, this piece, to be picked off the truck in perfect balance, somehow like right this, and then stood up and also being perfect balance, so that I could maneuver this thing myself manually and handle it by my crane using my radio remote. And so I was able to handle both this piece and the other piece myself. There's that jig I talked about. It looks simple, but it's very precisely positioned. The trapeze allowed the whole thing to come up vertically. So I got pretty good at handling it, but believe me, I was mighty scared. And so I thought, what if I have wind? So one day it was pretty breezy when it was set up at traps, and I thought, well, this is like the Navy. They send their pilots out there in storms and at night on carriers. Everybody's got to be able to do it. So I went up in the wind and made sure that I could take that thing apart, put it together by myself in the wind, and it worked out okay. So then I thought, well, I can handle this thing by myself, pretty easy, and I'm going out there anyway. Maybe I could stop and set it up. That would be cool, I thought. That would be interesting. And following on the whole exposed idea, I was thinking, I might just set it up in a Walmart parking lot, hang around, talk to people. And so, that was really the original concept, and I thought this might be really misguided. So I thought, who can I get a second opinion from? And I called somebody whose opinion I thought, who had a lot of experience with public art, really was a voice of reason that I could depend on, the director of this institution, Rachel Moore. I laid it out to her and I said, Rachel, is this crazy? And when she said, no, it's not crazy, then I moved forward another notch with it. So it started to get real. And I was talking with an old college friend of mine, and she said, if you do that, I'm handling your publicity. She and her husband had been public relations people in New York in arts, primarily the performing arts, but she had experience in it. She liked it, and she said, okay, are you going to do it? I was sort of pushing on this, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it. So, okay, how much are you going to pay me? And we finally made a deal, and I traded a sculpture for her, and she really went to work. And then the questions came, how long can you spend on the road? How many places can you stop? How far out of the route are you willing to go? And I was kind of like, I'm just planning to drive out there. But it got rolling and it sort of got out of hand, and she set up the spots, all of the places to stop along the way, and made contacts with the people, and then sort of said, okay, do you want to go here? Want to go there? And that's the way that the venues were selected. So on April 20, I left home and headed out on this grand adventure that I was looking forward to, a little bit scared of, but that's the way it went. And the first stop that was at Pratt Munson Williams College in Utica, New York. This is a sister school in a 2-year program that's a feeder system for Pratt in Brooklyn. And the students there are embarking on our careers in the arts, and I was invited to give a talk to them. And I was kind of torn between like, yeah, it's great, and like, oh, man, find an easier way to make a living. But some of them were very engaged in it and were very interested in it. A lot of them were in graphic arts and were more 2D things, but it was an interesting time there. And you can see there's a parking lot in the college. The local paper put me on the front page above the fold. Can't get better than that. Next stop was Rochester Public Market. And this was really my favorite place. It's a big public market. It's been there for almost 150 years. And it's every man or every woman. You know, there's people juggling and serving coffee and selling fish, and then people come and sell tomatoes and buy tomatoes. But the point is, it's not really your art crowd. And I want to tell you a little story about that later, but I just thought it was a terrific thing, so I love that. This was a painting that somebody came along while I was doing it, and she sat down and she sketched it out, and then she went back and did a watercolor of it, and I just really loved that. And I like that. Christopher Curtis goes on tour, drags along a sculpture. In Cleveland, this was University Circle at Cleveland, and that slide on the right there, that's my micro show at the Cleveland Institute of Art with Alberto Giacometti. This was great, and the public arts coordinator for Cleveland really made this happen in a very clever way. She knew that we were doing this at no charge, unsupported, it didn't need help from anybody except put it there, that we could put it up, take it down quickly. There was no need for any other equipment or people. And so she cleverly made a list of 18 different venues that she thought were appropriate to this. Public places in the city, private developers that had space, community places that had parks, 18 places, and she sent it out, and she said, this is a cool project and it's going to get snatched up quickly. Let me know if you want it. It won't last long. And that was true. So we had to turn down people in Cleveland. But this beautiful place on University Circle, which is sort of Cleveland's equivalent of Central Park, the Botanics Gardens there, the Art Museum, the Museum of Natural History. So anyway, that's where that was. It was good. Then we went to the Cincinnati Observatory. This is cool too. That place in the stars, it's got to go there. Now this observatory was interesting because it's really the people's observatory. It was cooked up about 175 years ago by some guys that just wanted to have a good telescope they can share. And so they got together and they made an organization and they sold shares in this enterprise in order to have an instrument that you could actually look through. You know, today's instruments, you might see pictures through them, but you're never going to be invited to go look. But this, they frequently have public viewings on clear nights, and they break out their 175-year-old telescope in the dome there, and you can look through it. So I just love that. And as I said, I have an interest in the stars, and I wound up buying a telescope while I was there. Finally, this was a pop-up. So I'm on the road there, and I get a call from Jane, and she goes, "Hey, you want to go to St. Louis?" I go, "Oh man, another one." Each one of these setups, you know, is scary for me. It's like, oh, I hope it goes good. No, you know, and it did, but it's scary each time. She said, "It would just be a great photo." And we had no place lined up yet. I said, "How are we going to find the right place? You know, there's going to be wires and trees in the way." And she goes, "Yeah, I know. I can Google Earth it." And so we brainstormed. And finally I said, "I know. We'll hire a local photographer. They will know." She jumped on that, called the St. Louis Dispatch, got shunted off to this photographer, Lori Skiven, and she turned out to be a Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist. And she said, "I'll meet you at this location," which I just went on faith. And she showed up at 3 o'clock. I had the thing set up. But before that, I had to we didn't have any permission to do this yet. And I roll in, and I think, do I talk to security or what am I going to do? Because it was rainy and really no one was there. And so I think I better go do that. So I talked to security, and of course she said, "Well, let me check with the boss." So pretty soon I'm talking on the telephone with the superintendent who's in another part of the city. But of course they have cameras. So he can see my truck and he can see where I'm standing, and we're talking on the telephone, negotiating where this thing might go. And finally he said, okay, yeah, put it in the bus turnaround. You're gonna be gone in 4 hours? Yeah, okay, you can do it. So I set it up there. We snapped these great pictures. The lawn guys were terrific. They were lawnmowers there. And these are not art people, but they came over and they were very curious about it, and that is part of the reason about this exposure to art that I keep harping on. So the lawn guys are there, and then the security guard came out, and she was over the top, and she was calling her girlfriends and FaceTiming them about this thing. It was really great. Finally, we arrived at the Philbrick Museum in Tulsa. Sculpture was there for 5 days. And ironically, this was certainly the most prestigious location, and just really happy and honored to be invited to put it there. But the irony of it was, these are all art people. They're going to the museum because they like art. So this was kind of like, so what to them? And I don't mean, I shouldn't say it so that way, but you know, it's just another day in the art world. It was a cool big one, but kind of so what. People engaged, they talked to me about it, but it wasn't like, wow, I've never seen anything like that before. What is that thing? Anyway, you know, so it served the exposure and exposed concept, but in a different way. So the final stop on this was the collector's home. And a whole project had been aimed at that spot. And, you know, I was trying to get there and make sure that all these other things fell into place. But when it went there, after all of the worry and the frustration and vexation and what have you, once it got there, it was going to be disappearing for the public sphere pretty much forever. And happily, the collector who commissioned this, of course I needed her concurrence to do this project. And so when I called her, I said, you know, I'm thinking of doing this tour. What do you think? Other people could see it before it gets, you know, really privately held. She said, that's a great idea. You know, I'll wait for it. Because we were coming up on the deadline. And she was all for it. And she said, take as long as you want, which was a very supportive position. So I thought that was pretty good. So here we were at her house, big crane reaching over the hedge to go inside. My handling system enabled that to be moved easily. We bolted it together. The installation was very clean. You know, maybe you can see this pencil mark on the side here, because we trial fit this thing before it went to the Philbrick Museum. I brought it over here because we needed concrete poured, and we trial fit it. And that little spot there meant that that foot would have been right on the edge of that paved part. So we had to cheat it over a little bit, and you can see that it moved a little bit because the lights that are embedded here are not quite centered. And you have to do that thing on the fly. There's just no other way to do it. So the installation was clean. It looks like it just comes out of the ground sort of magically. It's high enough that you can walk underneath it. That's the beckoning point through the garden. And you know, you saw that first slide where that giant one, but this scale fits that. That's a big garden. And so that little stanchion of art that you saw in the architectural drawings probably would have been a mistake. This is more appropriate in scale, we think. So it was a bittersweet ending to that project. You know, I'd been working with this client for 2 years, and now it's kind of like, okay, I got to go home now, and you know, sort of. But I was happy about it. The installation was flawless, and the whole way there were no injuries to people, no damage to the sculpture, no broken plants, no dings in the stonework, no truck breakdowns along the way, no speeding tickets, no trouble with the DOT. You know, no lost credit cards or cell phones, basically no problem. And so once that was in, I could finally breathe. And so on the trip home, the pressure was off. I decided, man, I've been at this hard. I'm just going to take it easy. And I kind of did. I went back to Cincinnati, picked up my telescope from the observatory, And I made my way to Lake Ontario, spent a couple days there chilling beside the lake. I went to Niagara Falls, and then finally I got home safe and sound, and Terry was there, and it was home. It was really great to be back after that journey. But that's not really the total end of the story. I'll leave you, this last thoughts about this, before I really get to the end of the story. You may have some questions or some thoughts about it that you might be reluctant to ask, and like, man, you look kind of old for this kind of caper, especially to go on solo. Is that really wise? You know, you might not ask that question, but, or you might say, boy, that trip looks like a lot of time, trouble, and expense. Was it really worth it? Or you just might ask, like, why would you do such a thing? Are you nuts? Or maybe in a more upbeat question, like, well, what was the best part of the tour? And if I answer that for you, you kind of get the other 2 or 3 questions answered also. There were a lot of best parts about it, but a couple of them stick out in my mind. And one of them was, when this was all done, and I had all my tools picked up, and I had the truck loaded up, and took the pictures, and we were standing there with the clients, and they were, time to say goodbye, and the woman, the lady, the lead client, wiped her eye, and she said, I feel like I'm going to weep. And I kind of felt the same, but that was very gratifying to know how much she appreciated the sculpture that was there. But the very best part of the tour that I'll leave you with to think about, what happened at the Rochester Public Market. Part of the reason it was my favorite place. I was standing by the sculpture, and this woman that didn't really look like she was too much of a museum goer walked up, and she had a daughter by the hand, maybe 6 or 7. She said, do you know anything about that thing? I said, yes, I do. I made it. What would you like to know? And she said, well, what is it? I said, that's a sculpture. That's art. And she turned to her daughter and said, that's a sculpture. That's art. And the daughter looks up. But the daughter asked the best question. She goes, well, what's it for? Right? Critical, good question. So, you know, I kind of like, out of the mouths of babes, right? So I said, well, do you wonder about it? Yeah. I said, well, that's part of what it's for. She said, what's the other part? I said, does it make you smile? And she was emphatically nodding. I said, that's the other part. And so we chatted a little while longer, and then when they turned and walked away, I could see the mother like talking to her daughter and say, wow, we just saw real art and talked to the artist that made it. That was pretty cool, wasn't it? And you know, the daughter was nodding, and then they turned the corner and were gone, and I thought, you know, that was just terrific. And we never know what influence we're going to have on people that we encounter. And there's this widening circle of influence, like a pebble dropped into still water. You just never know where it's going to go. And I don't know if that 6 or 7-year-old has completely forgotten that now, or whether there's some little influence that might make her an art appreciator or even an artist later in life. We can't ever know that for sure, but there is something I'm really sure about. I gave it my best shot. Thank you. Thank you.